The woman's hand remained on his chin, and Boone found himself unable to step backward, unable to break free from her gaze. Her grip was gentle but firm, like someone who had never doubted her right to touch whatever she pleased. The scent of lavender mixed with something earthier, leather and dust from long travels, filled his nostrils. "I asked you a question," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made lesser men confess sins they'd never committed. "Will you stay in our room tonight?" His throat felt dry as old parchment. "Ma'am, I don't understand. This is my house. My room." The words came out weaker than he'd intended, more plea than declaration. She smiled then, an expression that held no warmth, but somehow made his pulse quicken despite every rational thought screaming danger. "Your house." She released his chin and stepped back, gesturing toward the room behind her with a sweep of her powerful arm. "Look around, Boone Shepherd. Does this still look like your house?" For the first time, he truly examined his own living space. His father's rifle, which had hung above the fireplace for 15 years, was gone. In its place hung a painting of 3 women standing beside a river, women who looked remarkably like the strangers now occupying his home. His mother's quilt had been replaced by thick wool blankets in deep burgundy. Even the arrangement of furniture had changed, everything positioned to create intimate conversation areas rather than the solitary comfort he'd grown accustomed to. "How long have you been here?" The question escaped, before he could consider whether he truly wanted the answer. The second woman, nearly as tall as the first but with auburn hair that caught the lamplight like copper wire, moved closer. "Long enough to make this place feel like home." Her voice carried a slight accent he couldn't place, something that spoke of distant territories and unfamiliar customs. The third woman remained near the kitchen doorway, silent as a mountain cat watching prey. Her dark eyes never left his face, studying his reactions with the intensity of someone reading a map to hidden treasure. "You haven't answered my question," the first woman said, stepping close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. She was nearly 6 inches taller than his own considerable height, and when she tilted her head down to meet his eyes, he felt like a child being scolded by an unusually beautiful schoolmarm. "I don't even know your names," he managed. "Names can wait." Her hand moved to rest against his chest, directly over his heart, which was beating fast enough to shame him. "But decisions cannot. You can sleep in your old room tonight with us, or you can sleep in the barn with the horses. Those are your only choices." The casual way she said, "your old room," made his blood chill. How long had they been planning this moment, and what exactly did they want from him that required him to stay the night under their watchful eyes? Before he could form another question, the third woman finally spoke from her position near the kitchen, her words cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "He doesn't remember us yet. Does he, Magnolia?" The name hit Boone like a physical blow. Magnolia. He searched his memory desperately, trying to place the name with the imposing woman standing before him, but found only blank spaces where recognition should have lived. "Remember you?" His voice cracked slightly. "Should I?" Magnolia's expression shifted, and for just a moment, something raw and wounded flickered behind her confident facade. The auburn-haired woman moved to her side, placing a protective hand on Magnolia's shoulder. 10 years is a long time," the auburn-haired woman said softly. "People change, especially when they have reasons to forget." The third woman emerged fully from the kitchen shadows, and in the better light, Boone could see she was younger than the other two, perhaps 25 to their 30. She carried a tin cup in her hands, steam rising from whatever hot liquid it contained. "Clementine thought you might be thirsty after your long ride," Magnolia said, nodding toward the younger woman. "She's always been thoughtful that way." Clementine, another name that should have meant something but didn't. She approached him with careful steps, as if he were a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. When she held out the cup, their fingers brushed briefly, and he noticed her hands were calloused from hard work, just like his own. The liquid was coffee, strong and bitter, exactly how he preferred it. The fact that they knew this detail about him sent another chill down his spine. "The third sister is Ivory," Magnolia continued, indicating the auburn-haired woman. "Though I suppose introductions are pointless if you truly don't remember any of us." Sisters. The word hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. 3 sisters who knew his coffee preferences, who had redecorated his house to their liking, who spoke of him as if he'd once been part of their lives. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it. "I don't remember. But perhaps if you told me where we met." Where we met. Ivory's laugh held no humor. That's one way to put it. Magnolia silenced her sister with a sharp look before turning back to Boone. You were different then. Younger. More innocent. She walked to the window and gazed out at the darkening sky. We all were. What happened between us? The question came out rougher than he intended, but he needed answers more than he needed politeness. Clementine set down her own cup and moved to stand beside her older sister. Despite their obvious strength, there was something fragile about the way they positioned themselves, as if they were protecting each other from old wounds. You made promises, Clementine said quietly. Important ones, to our father. The mention of their father hit him like a punch to the gut. Suddenly, fragments of memory began to surface, not clear images, but emotions. Guilt, shame, the terrible weight of a debt he'd never been able to repay. Jacob Voss, he whispered, the name emerging from some locked chamber in his mind. All three women went rigid at the sound of their father's name. So you do remember, Magnolia said, her voice now cold as winter wind. You remember our father, the man who trusted you, the man who died because of that trust. The coffee cup slipped from Boone's suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering on the wooden floor like his fragile sense of safety. Because now he understood why three powerful women had taken over his house, why they'd been waiting for him with such patient determination. They hadn't come for romance or seduction. They'd come for justice. And they believed he owed them a debt that could only be paid in blood. The broken coffee cup lay scattered across the floor, like pieces of his shattered peace of mind. Boone stared at the fragments, trying to piece together memories that felt as sharp and dangerous as the ceramic shards at his feet. Jacob Voss, he repeated, the name tasting like ashes in his mouth. Your father he was a good man. Was. Magnolia's voice cut through the air like a whip. That word carries all the weight of your guilt, doesn't it, Boone? More fragments surfaced now, unbidden and unwelcome. A handshake agreement, a promise to watch over something precious. The crushing weight of failure when everything went wrong. The cattle drive, he whispered, the memory hitting him with the force of a runaway horse. The cattle drive to Denver. Ivory moved closer, her footsteps deliberate on the wooden floor. Now he remembers. 300 head of cattle, our father's entire herd, his whole future riding on that drive. And you were supposed to guide them safely through the mountain passes, Clementine added, her voice softer than her sister's but no less accusatory. You knew those trails better than any man in 3 territories. The guilt he'd buried for a decade rose in his throat like bile. The storm came out of nowhere. We lost half the herd in the first night. The rest scattered when the lightning spooked them. Our father mortgaged everything for that drive, Magnolia said, circling him slowly like a predator studying wounded prey. The ranch, the house, even Mother's wedding ring. He trusted you to bring back enough money to save us from losing everything. Boone closed his eyes, but the memories kept coming now, relentless as floodwater. Jacob Voss had been desperate, a proud man brought low by drought and debt. The cattle drive to Denver had been his last hope, and Boone had been the only guide experienced enough to get the herd through the treacherous mountain passes before winter set in. I tried to find them, he said weakly. I spent weeks searching for the scattered cattle. Weeks. Ivory's laugh was bitter as burnt coffee, while our father rode home empty-handed to face the bank. While creditors took our land piece by piece. While he... She stopped, unable to finish. While he what? Boone forced himself to meet her eyes. Clementine stepped forward, tears glistening on her cheeks like morning dew, while he put a gun to his head rather than watch his daughters lose their home because he'd trusted the wrong man. The words hit Boone harder than any physical blow could have. He staggered backward until his shoulders hit the wall, the breath knocked out of him as completely as if he'd been trampled by the very cattle he'd failed to protect. Jacob shot himself? The question came out as barely a whisper. 3 days after you disappeared into those mountains, Magnolia said, her voice now carrying a terrible calm. 3 days of watching everything he'd built slip away, because you couldn't do the one thing he'd paid you to do. Boone slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor among the broken coffee cup pieces, his hands shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know. God help me. I never knew. You didn't know because you never came back to find out, Ivory said. You took your guide fee and disappeared, leaving us to bury our father and start over with nothing. Magnolia knelt beside him, her hand once again cupping his chin, forcing him to look at her. But this time, her touch carried menace instead of seduction. Now you know why we're here, she said softly. and why you're going to spend tonight in our room, doing exactly what we tell you to do." The promise in her voice made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Boone remained on the floor, surrounded by broken ceramic and broken memories, while the weight of Jacob Voss's death settled on his shoulders like a yoke meant for oxen. The three sisters stood over him, their shadows falling across his body like the bars of a prison cell. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice hoarse with shame. "Money? I can give you everything I have, but it won't bring your father back." Magnolia rose to her full imposing height, looking down at him with eyes that held no forgiveness. "Money." She spoke the word as if it tasted foul. "You think this is about money? We spent 10 years tracking you down," Ivory added, moving to stand beside the fireplace where her father's rifle should have hung. 10 years learning to become strong enough to face the man who destroyed our family. Clementine remained near the kitchen, but her silence felt more dangerous than her sister's words. She was studying him with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had been missing crucial pieces. "Then what?" Boone struggled to his feet, glass crunching under his boots. "What kind of justice are you looking for?" Magnolia moved closer, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her powerful frame. The same kind our father found in his barn that morning. Final and permanent. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. But something about the way Clementine shifted uncomfortably caught his attention. The youngest sister looked away when he met her gaze, as if she couldn't bear to watch what was coming next. "You want to kill me," he said, surprised by how calm his own voice sounded. "Then do it. I won't fight back. God knows I deserve whatever you think justice looks like." But instead of satisfaction, his words seemed to anger Magnolia further. She grabbed the front of his shirt with both hands and slammed him back against the wall with enough force to rattle his teeth. "Don't you dare," she hissed, her face inches from his. "Don't you dare make this easy by playing the noble martyr. You don't get to choose how this ends." Her proximity was overwhelming, the scent of lavender mixed with leather, the warmth of her breath against his skin, the raw power in her grip. Despite the terror of his situation, his body responded to her closeness in ways that shamed him. "Magnolia." Clementine's voice cut through the tension. "We need to talk, privately." The sisters exchanged a look that carried meanings Boone couldn't decipher, but he sensed a crack in their united front. Ivory frowned, clearly displeased with her younger sister's interruption. "Later," Magnolia said without taking her eyes off Boone. "After we... Now." Clementine's voice carried unexpected authority. "There are things we need to discuss before we go any further." Magnolia's grip on his shirt tightened for a moment before she released him abruptly, leaving him gasping against the wall. "Don't move," she commanded. "Don't even think about running. There's nowhere to go that we won't find you." The three sisters moved toward the kitchen, their voices dropping to urgent whispers that he couldn't quite make out. But he caught fragments, words like wrong and mistake and not what father wanted. Boone pressed his ear closer to the wall, straining to hear more. What he caught made his blood run cold. "Saw the grave marker myself," Clementine was saying. "The dates don't match what we were told." "That's impossible," Ivory replied sharply. "Mother told us—" "Mother lied," Clementine interrupted. "About the timing, about the cattle drive, about everything." Magnolia's response was too quiet to hear, but the sharp intake of breath from her sisters was audible even from the next room. Whatever Clementine had discovered, it was changing everything. And Boone realized that after 10 years of planning their revenge, the Voss sisters were about to learn that they might have come for the wrong man entirely. If this story is touching you in any way, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with someone who loves a good Western tale, and subscribe to the Western Redemption channel. Every single day at exactly 10 a.m., a brand new story drops, packed with emotion, justice, and redemption. So turn on the notification bell and don't miss the next chapter. Because out here in the West, no one waits around. The whispered argument in the kitchen grew more heated, and Boone caught enough words to piece together a revelation that made his legs weak. Dates, timing, a grave marker that told a different story than the one they'd been raised believing. When the sisters emerged from their hushed conference, the dynamic between them had shifted dramatically. Clementine walked with newfound confidence, while Ivory's face showed confusion and anger. Magnolia moved like a woman whose entire world had been tilted off its axis. "Tell him," Clementine said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Magnolia's jaw clenched. "Clementine, this changes nothing. He still— Tell him about the grave, Clementine interrupted, her tone brooking no argument despite being the youngest. Boone felt his heart hammering against his ribs. What grave? Ivory sank into his father's old chair, looking suddenly fragile despite her imposing size. Our father's grave. The marker shows he died 2 months before the cattle drive was supposed to happen. The words hit Boone like a physical blow. That's impossible. I spoke with Jacob the week before we were set to leave. I shook his hand on the deal. No, Magnolia said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 10 years of misdirected rage. You shook hands with someone else. Someone who used our father's name and reputation to secure your services. Clementine moved closer, her earlier fear replaced by urgent need for truth. Mother told us you disappeared with the cattle money after father's funeral. She said the shame of your betrayal drove him to take his own life. But the dates prove she lied. Boone's mind raced through the implications. If Jacob Voss had already been dead when the cattle drive was arranged, then who had he made the deal with? Who had known enough about the Voss family situation to impersonate a desperate rancher? Your mother, he said slowly. Where is she now? The sisters exchanged another loaded glance. Dead, Ivory said flatly. Died of fever 3 years ago. But before she passed, she gave us a letter. Told us to read it only after we'd found you and made you pay for what you'd done. What did the letter say? Boone asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. Magnolia reached into her shirt and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn soft from handling. She opened it carefully, as if the words might bite her fingers. It says our father was killed by her brother, our Uncle Curtis, who wanted the ranch for himself. After the murder, Curtis used father's identity to arrange the cattle drive, planning to steal the money and disappear. But you lost the herd in the storm, so there was no money to steal. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Boone felt a strange mixture of relief and horror washing over him. Relief that he hadn't caused Jacob's death, horror at the decade of guilt he'd carried for no reason. Curtis Monroe, he whispered, the name emerging from buried memory. I remember him now. He met me at the saloon, said he was representing Jacob because Jacob was too ill to travel. He disappeared right after the cattle drive failed, Clementine said. Mother claimed he'd gone east to find work, but she knew the truth. She knew he'd killed father and tried to steal from the cattle drive, and she let us believe you were responsible. Magnolia crumpled the letter in her fist, her knuckles white with rage. But this time, her anger wasn't directed at Boone. 10 years, she breathed. 10 years we spent planning revenge against an innocent man. The weight of their shared realization hung between them like morning fog, and Boone understood that everything had changed. The 3 sisters who had come seeking vengeance now found themselves in need of something else entirely, his help in finding their father's true killer. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled to its breaking point. Magnolia stood frozen with the crumpled letter in her fist, while her sister seemed unable to meet Boone's eyes. The weight of 10 years of misdirected hatred filled the room like smoke from a grass fire. I'm sorry, Magnolia said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. God help me, I'm so sorry. Boone rose slowly from where he'd been pressed against the wall, glass from the broken coffee cup crunching under his boots. You couldn't have known. Your mother lied to protect a murderer. We came here to destroy you, Ivory said, her words heavy with shame. We trained ourselves to be strong enough, ruthless enough. We planned every detail of how we'd make you suffer. Clementine moved to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. All these years, Curtis has been living free while father lies in his grave, while we tormented ourselves with thoughts of revenge against the wrong man. Boone studied the 3 women who had invaded his home with such deadly purpose. Even knowing the truth, they remained formidable. Their strength hadn't been built only for revenge. It had been forged by necessity, by the hard years of surviving alone after losing everything. Where do you think Curtis went? He asked. Magnolia looked up sharply, something dangerous flickering in her eyes. You're going to help us find him? Your father was a good man. If Curtis Monroe killed him and tried to use me as cover for theft and murder, then yes, I'll help you find him. The transformation in the room was immediate. Where moments before there had been accusation and shame, now there was shared purpose. The sisters drew together, their collective strength focusing on a new target. Mother's letter mentioned he had a claim up north, Ivory said, near the Copper Creek territory. Said he bragged about silver in the hills before he disappeared. Copper Creek is 3 days' ride, Boone said. Rough country, dangerous for travelers, especially women traveling alone. Magnolia's laugh held an edge like broken glass. We've been dangerous women for 10 years, Boone Shepherd. We can handle rough country. She moved closer to him. But this time her proximity felt different. The predatory menace had been replaced by something more complex, an awareness that they were no longer enemies, combined with the lingering attraction that had been building since he'd first seen her in his doorway. "But we don't have to travel alone anymore," she said softly, her hand coming to rest on his chest where she'd felt his racing heartbeat earlier. "Do we?" The question carried layers of meaning that made his pulse quicken for entirely different reasons than fear. She was no longer the vengeful woman who had threatened his life. She was a woman who had spent 10 years building strength and purpose, who now stood close enough that he could count the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "No," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You don't." Clementine turned from the window, something urgent in her expression. "We need to leave tomorrow morning. I saw rider tracks near the corral when we arrived. Fresh ones." The mood in the room shifted again, back to alertness and danger. "What kind of tracks?" Boone asked. 3 horses, shod, moving fast toward the house, then away again when they saw smoke from the chimney. Magnolia's hand tightened on his chest. "Curtis?" Clementine nodded grimly. "Or men working for him. Either way, he knows we're here now." Boone felt the familiar weight of danger settling on his shoulders, but this time he wasn't facing it alone. 3 women who had spent a decade preparing for war were now his allies instead of his executioners. But if Curtis Monroe was already watching them, their hunt might have just become a battle for survival. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Boone was already awake, having spent the night on the floor near the fireplace while the sisters shared his bedroom. The arrangement had been practical rather than romantic, but he'd been acutely aware of Magnolia's presence just beyond the thin wooden door. 3 riders, Ivory whispered from her position at the window, coming hard from the north. Boone checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded and ready. The sisters moved with practiced efficiency, each taking positions that would give them clear lines of sight through different windows. Their movements spoke of years of preparation, and he realized they had trained for scenarios exactly like this one. "Curtis?" Magnolia asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Has to be," Clementine replied from her post near the kitchen door. "Same number of tracks as yesterday, same direction." The riders pulled up just outside rifle range, close enough to be seen clearly but far enough away to make conversation difficult. Curtis Monroe sat his horse like a man who had grown comfortable with authority over the past 10 years. He was thicker around the middle than Boone remembered, but his eyes held the same calculating coldness that had made their original meeting feel wrong. "Boone Shepherd," Curtis called out, his voice carrying easily across the morning air. "I see you've been entertaining my nieces. Hope they've been good company." The casual way he claimed kinship with the women he'd orphaned made Magnolia's jaw clench with visible rage. She raised her rifle, but Boone caught her arm gently. "Let me handle this," he said quietly. He came to talk, or he would have shot through the windows already. Boone stepped onto the porch, keeping his rifle ready but not overtly threatening. "Curtis Monroe, been wondering when you'd show yourself again. Have you now?" Curtis's smile held no warmth. Funny thing about wondering, it can be dangerous for a man's health, especially when he starts wondering about things that happened a long time ago. Things like murdering your brother-in-law and stealing his identity. The accusation hung in the morning air like gun smoke. Curtis's 2 companions shifted nervously in their saddles, but Curtis himself seemed almost amused. "Proof's a tricky thing, Shepherd. Dead men tell no tales, and the only woman who knew the truth took it to her grave. Leaves you with 3 grieving nieces and a lot of wild accusations." "The letter," Magnolia called from inside the house. "Mother left a letter confessing everything." Curtis's smile faltered slightly. "Letters can be forged. Memories can be unreliable. But bullets," he patted the rifle across his saddle. "Bullets are honest." "So are graves," Boone replied. "Jacob Voss's grave marker shows he died 2 months before our cattle drive. Kind of hard to explain how he hired me when he was already buried." For the first time, Curtis looked genuinely concerned. His hand moved toward his weapon, and Boone knew the talking was over. "You should have left well enough alone," Curtis said, raising his rifle. The morning exploded into gunfire as all 3 windows of the house erupted simultaneously with muzzle flashes. The Voss sisters had waited 10 years for this moment, and their aim was devastating in its precision. When the smoke cleared, Curtis Monroe lay face down in the dirt where he'd fallen from his saddle, while his two surviving companions rode hard toward the horizon, wanting no part of a fight against three women who shot like avenging angels. Justice, at long last, had come home to roost. The silence that followed the gunfire felt different from any quiet Boone had ever experienced. It was the silence of completion, of a debt finally paid, and a circle finally closed. Curtis Monroe's body lay still in the morning sun, and with it died the lies that had shaped 10 years of misdirected pain. Magnolia emerged from the house first, her rifle still in her hands but pointing toward the ground. Her sisters flanked her, and together they approached the man who had stolen their father and tried to destroy their lives. "It's over," Clementine said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "Is it?" Ivory asked, nudging Curtis's body with her boot. 10 years of planning for this moment, and it's over in 30 seconds. Boone watched the sisters grapple with the reality of their accomplished revenge. He'd seen it before in men who had spent years hunting those who wronged them. The strange emptiness that came when the driving purpose of your life suddenly disappeared. "What happens now?" he asked gently. Magnolia looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, her expression was vulnerable rather than commanding. "We never planned for after. We only ever planned for this moment." The admission hung between them like morning mist. Three women who had built their entire adult lives around a single goal now faced a future without that defining purpose. "The ranch we grew up on is still there," Clementine said. "Curtis never sold it. We could go back." "To what?" Ivory shook her head. "Ghosts and memories. A place where everything reminds us of what we lost." Magnolia walked slowly toward the corral where their horses waited, her powerful frame somehow seeming smaller now that the weight of vengeance had been lifted from her shoulders. Boone followed, drawn by something he couldn't name. "You could stay," he said quietly, when they were out of earshot of her sisters. She turned to face him, those green eyes searching his face for meaning. "Here, with you. This house has felt empty for too long, and after last night," he moved closer, close enough to see the pulse beating at her throat. "After learning what really happened, after fighting beside you instead of against you," she raised her hand to cup his cheek. The same gesture she'd used to threaten him now transformed into tenderness. "You want 3 dangerous women living in your house permanently?" "I want you living in my house permanently," he corrected, his voice rough with emotion. "Your sisters are welcome, but it's you I can't stop thinking about, even when I thought you were here to kill me." Her smile was the first truly happy expression he'd seen from her. "Is that your way of accepting my invitation from yesterday? To stay in our room tonight?" "Your room is my room," he said, pulling her closer until her forehead rested against his. "It has been since the moment you walked through that door." When their lips met, it was with 10 years of misdirected anger transforming into passion that neither of them had expected to find. She was still physically stronger than him, still capable of breaking him in half if she chose, but her strength now promised protection rather than destruction. "I think," she murmured against his mouth, "we'll make this ranch feel like home again." Behind them, Ivory and Clementine were already discussing practical matters, burying Curtis, explaining the situation to the local authorities, deciding what to do with their old property. But Boone barely heard them. For the first time in a decade, his house would be filled with voices and laughter instead of lonely echoes. 3 sisters who had learned to be dangerous would now learn to be happy. And the woman in his arms, who had whispered threats in his ear just yesterday, would be whispering entirely different things tonight. The sunrise painted the sky in shades of gold and promise, and Boone Shepherd finally understood that sometimes the most unexpected visitors bring exactly what you never knew you needed. Justice had been served, love had been found, and the ranch that had stood empty for too long would never be lonely again. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Wild West tale, where justice and passion collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.